Hello, and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. I am your host, Kelly Blahos, and I look forward each week to introducing you to friends, new and old, who will join me in lifting up the rock and exposing the corruption, hubris, and petty but powerful politics of American empire's imperial city, crawling around underneath. The old adage of nothing is what it seems in Washington has never been more true today, so much that regular Americans don't believe anything coming from inside the Beltway whatsoever. We're going to try to reconcile that with plain old inquiry and truth here on the show from experts with no axe to grind, except with corruptible and corrupted power itself. So with that, I'd like to introduce my two guests today. I'm very excited. Katrina Vanden Heuvel is editorial director and publisher of The Nation and served as editor of the magazine from 1995 to 2019, a frequent commentator on U.S. and international politics for ABC, NBC, CNN, and PBS. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Boston Globe, and she writes or has written, I'll have to ask her about that, a weekly column for the Washington Post. She's also author of several books, including The Change I Believe in, Fighting for Progress in the Age of Obama, and is also the president of the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord. She's joined by my friend James Carden, who is a columnist and former advisor to the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission at the State Department. His articles and essays have appeared in a wide variety of publications, including The Nation, American Conservative, Responsible Statecraft, Spectator, Unheard, National Interest, Los Angeles Times, and others. So a big welcome to you on Trip the Beltway Fantastic, Katrina and James.
Thank you, Kelly.
I'm excited about this conversation. I want to talk about progressivism and foreign policy in our post 9/11 world. I'm choosing the time period post 9/11 for our discussion, not because it's the most, not only because it's the most relevant to us today, but because it would seem that there is a tremendous shift going on, particularly starting after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and into the Trump administration among progressives about what might be considered a restrained foreign policy today. Because of Trump, much of the skepticism about the power in Washington primacy abroad, even intrusive nature of the national security state on the homeland, all of that appeared subsumed by progressives' fears and anxiety and hatred towards Trump. Can you talk a little bit about that, about maybe how you experienced old friends and their resistance in the anti-war movement because of these other political considerations at the time? In other words, has the progressive anti-war movement suffered because of Russiagate and other Washington considerations vis-a-vis the Trump and his effect on the left and progressivism? Do you want to start, Katrina, with that question? I know it's a big one, but
first of all, congratulations on the podcast. I like very much the idea of inquiry. I think people rush too quickly to assert, and often the worst voices do that very quickly. I think there are different wars that have influenced different people, and I think in the progressive community the same. But there's a generation, Vietnam had the most influence to go back, and then Iraq, obviously. But also there are people like Samantha Power, who were greatly influenced by Rwanda, responsibility to protect. I do think that the Trump madness has deeply affected the political landscape. I'm not sure the militarism, which we are witnessing around us, is that new. I think it's been taken to new extremes. The institutions that were not military are being militarized. But the United States has a long history of empire. I mean, we did a special issue years ago on the annexation of Hawaii. I mean, there are other examples, obviously. But I'm most worried about the idea that what was once open to diplomacy, or to ideas that some may consider unorthodox. For example, NATO. NATO in 1997, when there was an effort to expand NATO, which succeeded, did arouse quite a bit of opposition. And what the New York Times or the Washington Post would consider real opposition, like Senator Bill Bradley, who, by the way, is on our committee, the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord. So, I mean, we'll talk more about this, but I do think there's been and I saw it at The Nation. James also saw it, and my late husband, Steve, that Trump was used in many ways to impose a kind of Russiagate orthodoxy on the coverage. There were letters flying around us, and the letters were like, "We can't feed Trump and his views." And the ability to hold 2.5 ideas in your mind at one time, I think, has been under great pressure. And I'll finish by saying we just posted an article, an op-ed. It's not mine, James. It's Robert Borsach's, and it's about this idea that we are facing the greatest threat. We are living in a time when the old order is like dying, the new one not yet born. But, we've gone through America, Reconstruction, the Red Scare, Palmer raids, into other examples. So I think we need to have, history does not justify, but it informs. And I think that's very important.
James, I'd love for you to follow up on that, but I also wanted to ask, and this is probably opening up a can of worms, but what is a progressive foreign policy today? I know that this is there's much to do about this subject in Washington right now, but I would love to hear each of you talk a little bit about what that might look like, and is it in the eye of the beholder here in DC?
Yeah, I'm not really sure I'm the right person to say what a progressive foreign policy is anymore. I can tell you generally what it's not, and what it's not is anti-war. There are a few exceptions, few honorable exceptions, one of whom is the other guest on the program. But I think, looking back, your first question basically was about, when did things start to change? And I think there were 2 key years. The first year is obvious, 2016, 2017, the birth of the Russiagate scandal. But the hawkishness that we see from the left began years earlier. And I think another key year in the post 9/11 world is 2011, 2012. And a number of things happened in that time period, which for a number of reasons, you began to see progressive foreign policy take on kind of a hawkish coloring. You had the decision by the then Prime Minister of Russia, Vladimir Putin, to return to the Kremlin. That took a number of people in the Obama administration by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
It should have, but it did. Then there was the Magnitsky Act, and this idea that Russia's internal issues were problems for us to address. And then, of course, there were the wars in Libya and Syria, and these were wars that were prosecuted under a Democratic administration. And for my money, as unpleasant as all the Russia stuff was and remains, the fight on the left, I think, was far more vicious over Syria. And really, I think that was the key changing moment when a lot of progressives abandoned anti-war almost altogether. And they rallied to Hillary Clinton's war cry of Assad must go. But they never really answered a few basic questions about that conflict. Who exactly was Assad? What was he doing? Why was he doing it? And who were his opponents? And basically, a sane approach would have recognized that his opponents were our opponents. And there's something similar going on. We can talk about this later with regard to the attack in Russia. But they seem to have a real blind spot. There was this real mania to get rid of this dictator who happened to run a multi-confessional state, a secular multi-confessional state. And I think so it was in that time frame between 2011 and 2017 when, in my view, left foreign policy really kind of went off the rails.
I think it was, first of all, I think there is a hope that one could build a kind of progressive realism. And many years ago, I've told James this, the Nation and the American Conservative had conversations, and particularly with Andrew Bacevich and Cheryl Sweninger, who was an advisor to the Nation. And I think it would have been very interesting, and we wouldn't have featured reproductive choice. We would have found those areas where we would find commonality and difference. But Bacevich at that time, Andrew Bacevich, was writing frequently for the TAC and for the Nation. So I found that heartening. I also think the opposition to Iraq, the Nation was one of the few progressive outlets, many liberal outlets smoothed the way, was an important measure of what existed, not just anti-war, but a belief that you go to war at the very last resort, and you seek dialogue and not moral posturing. So I think we've entered a stage where James is right about 2011, 2017, but there was also 2007, right, James, in Munich? It's not just Putin showing, and essentially, I'll get in trouble for this, but it could have been an editorial from the American Conservative or the Nation. It was just hard and it was tough speech. But what shocked Angela Merkel, I think, and Lieberman, McCain, was that Russia was no longer on its knees. There was an anticipation that Russia would remain on its knees as it had been, Putin-esque. Yeltsin, who began de-democratization. But I do think that there were opportunities. James and I were talking on the weekend. Putin was the first global leader to reach out to George W. Bush after 9/11. And there was a belief, like it or not, that Russia and the United States could be in coalition in fighting the forces such as ISIS-K, etc.
Oh, yeah.
That was a big, and then that fell apart. Forces inside the administration, John Bolton's ascendancy, the unraveling of arms control. But I'll stop and just say, for me, the tone is half of life. And, it's quoted in the paper yesterday in the Times, which has committed itself to doing nuclear coverage, which is good, the danger of nuclear weapons. But to hear in 1985 that the two leaders said we will never wage nuclear war can never be waged, seems almost radical in the context of the triumphalism that has so surrounded these last years.
In that time period that you're raising between, let's just say, 2007 and 2012 also dovetails with this idea, and maybe responsibility to protect came after that, but it definitely dovetails with this idea. So you mentioned Samantha Power, that the United States has an obligation to intercede militarily or otherwise when we see humanitarian crises unfold. And as you all well know, Samantha Power's her impetus, her inspiration was Rwanda, and that under the Clinton administration, Washington didn't move fast enough to prevent the massacres there and the genocide. There seemed to be a shift away from that, an acknowledgement. Maybe Libya had a role in this, maybe Syria, I don't know, away from R2P, at least in that iteration.
Could I just say that, picking up on what James said also, someone like Anne-Marie Slaughter, when I was writing for the Post, and I stopped about a year ago, but she had a big editorial about the need to bomb Syria in order to show power in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's like the playground for the United States to decide where it's going to intervene. And it has been the anniversary in the last weeks, I believe, of Yugoslavia, of Serbia. And, the man who might have been prime minister in a different Russia was Yevgeny Primakov, who was a very interesting foreign minister for a while. He was in the air when he learned about the bombing, and Moscow called him back. It was a serious, underreported quasi-war in which, by the way, Wesley, what's his name? Wesley Clark, he nearly
Mhm.
took us to war, right?
Yeah, in a confrontation at the airport in Yugoslavia.
Airport.
And the British general refused to follow Clark's order to fire
right.
on the landing Russian troops. So, we
Which
nearly
just
had
shows American
War-
arrogance.
we almost had World War III 25 years ago. Slaughter's comment is interesting because it shows how little has changed. She wanted to use that as a demonstration in the same way Truman wanted to use the bombs as a
Yeah.
demonstration to the Soviets, and in the same way that a lot of the architects of the Vietnam War wanted to shore up our credibility by making an example out of Viet Cong. I would say that there's, with regard to progressive foreign policy, a very serious cultural element that has kind of emerged over the past several years, a kind of Cold War culture war, which is a term I, with permission, shamelessly stole from Sherrill. And I think that plays a large part of it as well, because what the neocons and the new progressive pro-interventionists share is this belief in American universality. And so, we have we see this belief among parts of the left that America really needs to make these other countries, which have more conservative traditions, to make them safe places for our kind of woke politics. So I think that that's another element of it as well.
I mean, it is the case that I would say Putin and Trump share similar constituencies in some ways, because Putin's real constituency is in the rural communities, which is why Navalny got 26% in 2013, the mayoral race. I mean, you see this in Turkey, for example, the election today, the mayor of Istanbul, and it's more religious, the constituency. I mean, I wrote a piece a few years ago about Pussy Riot in Moscow, and what shocked people is, and this happens so often, people abroad have a different kind of rep than, they were not that beloved and they weren't that known inside Russia, which is I think 8 time zones. So you're right, James, but there's been that universality prior almost, like, what do you do about atrocities? I mean, or what cutting? I mean, there are a whole set of issues, but I do think a realism, understanding the need to talk, and the demonization of diplomacy, a criminalization.
I have a kind of amusing story about the Pussy Riot thing. So when I was at State, I accompanied a very left-wing documentarian who lives in Soho over to accept an award in Ekaterinburg, and he went to a school. It was like a cultural exchange, things that we don't sadly do anymore. And he met some high school students, and they were really excited to meet this hotshot American filmmaker. And he's giving his talk, and everything's going really great until the very end, where he, out of nowhere, raises his arm and exclaims, "Free Pussy Riot." And he was met with total puzzle, just silence. And he couldn't understand why. He thought that he was going to, electrify. Yeah. But people found what they did in the cathedral to be disgusting, which it was. But, a lot of American liberals seem to, think otherwise.
Just to step back a little, I mean, one quick thing is, I do think President Biden is beginning to break the back of a neoliberal economy domestically, which is of value and important. But how you have a semi-transformative domestic policy with a really old thinking, old Cold War kind of authoritarians versus Democrats, this Manichaean view of the world, I don't know what happens to the priorities, the capacity, the funding of what needs to happen here if Biden's going to be a successful president. So,
well, and after the failures of both Afghanistan and Iraq, once those failures became too evident to dismiss whatsoever anymore, there did seem to be a little lull in the idea that the United States could do anything, including impose their own values, spread democracy, save the world through military force. But I've seen all that upended with the war in Ukraine. And to the extent where the Quincy Institute, where I work, had been widely attacked by our friends on the left, those in the anti-war camp, many of them who had signed on to the idea of this transpartisan Quincy Institute reforming foreign policy in favor of diplomacy over militarization, because they felt like we were denying the Ukrainians agency by not giving them everything they needed to wage war until it expunged Ukraine of Russia. And they did not understand, or didn't want to understand, that we were sticking to principles on restraint and didn't feel like fueling or prolonging the war would actually help Ukrainians in the long run. I would imagine that both of you, I know a little bit of your history at the Nation, faced similar pushback from friends and colleagues on the left when you didn't go all in on the perceived pro-Ukrainian approach in that war. And they might not call it responsibility to protect anymore, but geez, they give it a name. I mean, it's the same ideological push that we saw 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Well, James and I, and James took the lead, the piece we wrote about a week ago, which is, you don't begin in 2013, 14, you begin in 2000. I mean, you do begin there, but it's prior to that, where Richard Holbrooke and John McCain and Yushchenko were sleeping on the ground, sleeping bags brought from the United States. We've forgotten to say one thing. I mean, there are a lot of people in the streets protesting Gaza. And so there's a hypocrisy also in the administration. These two wars are going on. One is not only covered more, but has quite a constituency, anti-war constituency, if that can be put that way. But I do think that the progressive community has a lot of thinking to do, because it was so, if you can be pushed in a way by Trump to really put aside principles, go all in. I've heard people talk about the Cheney-Chomsky axis, that you have to be a popular front in order to take down Trump. Yes, but if the problem is, and I'll stop, campaigning traditionally is also how you govern. There's styles of governance, and you think about that and the kind of US American style censorship. Steve and I did a book years ago in 1990 called Voices of Glasnost. Every week, 2 or 3 of the people we interviewed had new ideas because things were moving the goalposts. I will say one thing that's really scary, James and I have been emailing about this, is what the goalposts shift every day. Like, you remember Biden saying no equipment will go into Russia? I mean, it is now literally a proxy war. It is not, and as Russians have come to see it, versus the West, not just Ukraine, Russia.
James, I know you and I have talked about this, and you've written about it extensively. The what seems to be the cognitive dissonance on the left over Ukraine and Russia, but then they've all seemed to come back our way on Gaza and Israel. Like, can you talk a little bit about how progressive anti-war left has been really railing, obviously, against sending more weapons to Ukraine, to Israel, minding humanitarian laws, the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions. It's a seeming 180. How do you feel about that? Because I'm glad to get as many people in the trenches as possible on these issues, but how do we reconcile that when the Ukraine war is still going on?
Well, I think we have talked about it. I think we see it slightly differently. I think that what you've seen with regard to Israel-Gaza is a real rallying and a welcome one among the activists, journalists, scholarly community. I happen to feel, though, that the political and sort of think tank Washington leaders were a little bit slow off the mark. I mean, it took people like Sanders and Khanna quite a while to finally come around to a sensible position. They, in the first awful weeks and months of that ongoing slaughter, they were rather silent. People like Warren and others, so certain think tank heads who I don't want to give more publicity to than they've already gotten. But while Schumer's speech is very welcome, unfortunately, it seems to me it's about 30,000 people too late.
So there's a real divide between, like, the centrist Democrats in Washington, Capitol Hill, and the activist progressive left and activist Democrats in the states and on the ground and in real America. That's where we're seeing the real divide.
Well,
I think that,
I also think that, in terms of like the more vocal, activists and journalists, I don't think that it's actually going to bleed over to their thinking with regard to Russia, Ukraine. I don't see any evidence of that.
No.
They're going to keep those things separate. It's hard for people to connect the dots on certain things, and I don't think those dots are going to be connected.
Though the Ukraine, I think the leadership has been wary of criticizing Israel. And Zelensky was, there are a lot of Russians in Israel. In fact, I knew of someone who was in Moscow and he left to go to Israel trying to evade the draft, and he got drafted in Israel. It's not, but I think the Progressive Caucus issued a very weak statement last year and then rolled it back because some of the members protested. They're not bold, but they're a little less timid now about where we are. And of course, it's the right where there's a lot of action and activity about the money. And every gyration possible has been done to get Ukraine more money. I don't know if you followed it, but the EU is going to confiscate. But again, I come back. These institutions like the EU, not our favorite, or the OSCE, these were institutions that were designed to get involved with economics and health and investment in domestics. And now it's all, how many weapons? I mean, think about the meetings that are happening. They're basically bringing in lists of weapons.
Yeah.
And I think, but
there's a similar split. I know that the topic is, I think it's supposed to be generally about the progressive side of things, but I think there's a similar split among members of what we might call right progressive, right restrainers.
Right restrainers. It's like flipped.
Where you have people who are critical of the Ukraine war, the funding effort. They're critical of NATO. They're critical of NATO expansion. And then they are awfully hard line with regard to Israel.
Absolutely.
It's the net cons. When they say net cons, I sometimes wonder what net they're referring to. I suspect it's not ours.
Nat.
Yeah. But, is that just leaves us even less of a narrow band of people for you and I. And I mean, like, what we're trying to do, which is operate on principled restraint, edicts here. It sort of narrows the band of people that we can work with at any given moment, because if we are working with more folks on the right during the Ukraine war because they were open to restraint, and the progressives weren't, that's just flipped. I feel like, on both sides, you have fair weather friends. I don't know how else to describe it, and I'm happy to work with anybody at any given moment because you need all the support you can get to pursue what the goals of the moment. But it does give you some very interesting insights on how people really view restraint. And it seems that many, and I don't want to say most, view it as an a la carte selection. Well, this is a good war. This is a bad war. This is where we need to intervene. This is where we need to hold back. And it's unfortunate.
I think you're so right. I do think that the restraint position has more support than many of the imperial projects out of DC, which are more elite. There's an elite approach, elite projects that don't really affect people's lives, except I would say trade. Once it gets into the trade piece, which is, we saw what Trump was able to do in the factory towns, even though he didn't come through. So I do think there's, I really dislike when people try to just shut off the conversation and say you're isolationist.
Ugh.
And I think that has to be addressed really squarely, because it's not that at all. It's just that the shortage of institutions, not to sound too stolid, is increasing and so it becomes war and weapons to a large extent. But I do think there are things to be done. And I think it's important not only, and I see this especially at the Nation, not only to oppose, but to propose, so that there's something, may not be fully realized, but there's an alternative to the going orthodoxy. There need to be more heretics. James knows that.
James, you're trying to get in.
You're a heretic.
I was just going to say, yeah, maybe I'll be burned at the stake. I was just going to say, being called an isolationist seems kind of refreshing, given what over the years, you and I.
The other names that have been hurled at us
saying it aren't that friendly about it, right? They're going to.
Well, I mean, I think the most unfortunate aspect of all this is that this is all about politics and partisanship. And so if you're a Democrat or you're on the left, you're more inclined to say, let's, stop the war in Gaza, ceasefire now. College campuses have been activated, and it's great to see. But like all of the protest, all of the energy is coming on the left for restraint in that war, and then on the right, it's like, well, if you're a Republican or if you're a MAGA pro-Trump conservative, you're going to be skeptical of all the money that we're giving to Ukraine. And you are going to be skeptical of our policies there because it's all tied to Russiagate and in their minds, Trump derangement syndrome. It was just like the vaccines. Either you're pro or you're against vaccines based on which side of the political aisle you're on. And that's no way to decide how you feel about foreign policy. You need to examine it for what it is, and then decide what you want to support or not support, not depending on your political party and what Fox News or MSNBC is telling you what to think.
MSNBC, oh my God, that's a story. That's a tale. I do think, though I admire Chris Hayes, who is our Washington correspondent, James, but Rachel Maddow, I used to do radio with her at Air America. She's a great talent. She used her talent or squandered her talent for many, many, many weeks at the height of Russiagate.
Yeah.
I mean, she had there was a Joe McCarthy feel to it. And that is very dangerous, not just for Ukraine, but for dissent and opposition to the ongoing kind of elite project. And we knew where the sources were coming from. I don't think we fully recovered. The Putin stuff is just I think every journalist has a key, hit it, but it's not helpful for inquiry and for thinking through alternatives again.
Right. And I think it's only going to get worse as we get closer to the election. We're already seeing a lot of reports coming from, intelligence services and Capitol Hill saying that the Russians are already engaging in disinformation campaigns, new and improved disinformation campaigns. We only got a minute or two left, so I have to ask you, and I will ask my friends on the conservative side the same question, but dealing with Trump. But how do you think Biden will fare in the upcoming elections?
Over to you, James.
Of Israel,
James
Gaza.
is more optimistic.
Not optimistic. I would just say that it's.
I know.
I think that he's going to fare better than we think. I think that it's
Biden.
quite possible
Biden.
Kennedy's going to play a spoiler and take from Trump, not from Biden. And
I
he
think
has serious problems in Michigan.
2025, this document the Heritage Foundation has provided us with. I have not read the foreign policy pieces. I gather on trade there are 3 entries because people couldn't make up their mind. But I think if it's Trump, he's going to be far more disciplined than he was in his time where he brought in John Bolton and all of this stuff. And that's, I think, what it's going to really revolve around. I hate to say this. I think China, to a large extent, and taxes. Tax. This is not new science. This is not new. But I do think that there'll be a measure of vengeance for the Russiagate believers, those who really embarked on that front.
But how do you think Biden is going to be in real trouble in the 2024 election?
So, Kelly, all I would say is it used to be said that a week in politics was about 6 months. I've never seen such, literally uncharted. There are no primaries to anchor around, to measure, to
That's right.
of people.
Maybe no debates.
So the journalists who shouldn't be commenting as it is are going to go overdrive. And we're going to have a lot of stuff. And I think keeping your head on straight with inquiry.
Yep. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I just want to make sure I tell the folks exactly where they can find all of your great writing. Is that at the U.S.-Russia Accord, The Nation? James, you're writing for the American Conservative and Responsible Statecraft. Anywhere else they should be looking for your writing?
Not unless it's been pilfered by RT this morning. Remember that whole issue? Oh my God. Business Insider and Bowser?
So that's another thing for another.
I literally, talking trigger, I get, Russiagate gives me like, But it is sad that what should be said by the Quincy with great intelligence or the American Committee is often degraded because Trump. You sound like a Trump. You're Trump.
Yeah, it's all politicized.
Yeah.
Weaponized.
Okay, well, on that note, but I love to have you guys back because I do feel that as we get closer to the election, there will be more hype about Russian interference. We'll see the ugly head of Russiagate appearing once again. We already are. So love to chat with you and set some records straight if we need to. Untrip the Beltway. Fantastic.
Yeah. By the way, everyone seems, there's a guy who was running for office who like there are all these people doing psilocybin and ketamine and all these drugs now. They're in office. I remember Ginsburg. You remember the guy who didn't get appointed because he smoked pot?
Yeah.
It's like now they're like off doing these crazy.
Yeah. And admitting it.
Well, thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, James.